Good morning, everybody. It's so great to see you. Before we start today's workshop, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, and also pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may also be here, of course past, present and future. Christine Slade is here today. She's part of my team. My name's Tracey Bretag, I should have said. We also have Guy Curtis from UWA and Margot McNeill from ICMS in Sydney. That's a private provider, the International College of Management Sydney. So we have a really qualified and scholarly team. So what we're going to do today, we're going to define academic integrity. And you must be like, oh no, please, I know this. Of course you do. But one of the key purposes of the workshop is to make sure that we develop shared understandings of academic integrity right across the sector. And while you do know what academic integrity is, I know, everyone has maybe a slightly different version in the way they define and practice it. So I'd like us all to share that definition, and then we'll all be on the same page for the workshop. You may then choose to adapt that or use that as you wish at your own institution. I'm going to take you through the Texas Higher Education Standards Framework, the particular standards that you need to adhere to and demonstrate compliance with, and more than compliance, you need to demonstrate that it matters. And I hope this workshop will help you demonstrate that. I'll chat to you briefly about the model statement of commitment to academic integrity, which is still in draft form but getting closer. The perhaps most dense part of the workshop will be where I'll take you through an overview of the academic integrity research and scholarship. I don't want to bore you too much. There's going to be 9 opportunities for you to speak throughout the morning, but that first part's going to be a little dense because I want to make sure that everybody knows the scholarship that exists already. We don't need to recreate the wheel. We've got a couple of decades or more of really solid research on which to base our decisions and our practice. Then I'll take you through the standards and give you some really good examples of each of them from a range of institutions across the country in relation to policies and procedures to promote and uphold academic integrity, actions to mitigate foreseeable risks to academic integrity, training and guidance for staff and students. At this point in every workshop, I stop and say, if you take nothing else away from today's workshop, nothing else, I would like you just to remember that. Number 7, we need to provide training and guidance for staff. We often do a pretty good job of talking to students. Our policies all around revolve around them. But really, unless we're committed to resourcing and supporting our staff, it's pretty much empty words. So I want you to all go back to your various institutions and be trailblazers and activists fighting for resources for your staff. You can go now if you've got nothing else to do. That's the main message from today. And I'll share some good practice about how we can build a culture of integrity for all stakeholders, and I'm sure you're going to have lots of examples to share with us as well. This PowerPoint has lots of links to references, other organisations, the research, and it's available through TEXA on their website. So this definition comes from Universities Australia, from their 2017 best practice principles, but of course they didn't make it up either. It came from the Exemplary Academic Integrity Project and also the International Centre for Academic Integrity. So it's not like this definition just comes out of a vacuum. According to UA 2017, academic integrity means acting with the values of honesty, trust, fairness, respect and responsibility. And here's the critical thing. Yeah, in learning, we always think about learning and we think about students, but it's also in teaching and it's also in research. We somehow seem to forget those 2 critical stakeholder groups. TEXA themselves, in their guidance notes and in the standards, talk about academic and research integrity and put them together, which I like because I think they are inextricably linked. UA further goes on and says universities, and that's also all higher education providers, consider that it's vital for students and staff to act in an honest way. So get this here, it's about acting in an honest way. We often think of academic integrity as something we do with text, something we do with sources. That is true, but it's actually just one part. It's how we act. It's how we act towards each other. It's how our students act towards us. It's how we act towards them. It's how people work in groups. It's how we acknowledge others' contributions. It's not just about text. It's about taking responsibility for our actions and every part of our work, every single aspect of our work. Here's the thing. You're all in this room because you need to be and you must be role models for students. They're going to learn about academic integrity from you. Academic integrity is important for an individual's reputation, whether you're a student, a researcher or a teacher, and obviously also an institution's reputation. So that comes from UA 2017. The whole thing is on their website, and it articulates further how you might put that into practice. But that's where we're going to start. I think it's not bad. As I said, it wasn't created in a vacuum. It was developed through a working group, a working advisory group to UA over a year, and drew on research. So the Higher Education Standards Framework. As I mentioned, academic and research integrity are together. You cannot separate them. TEXA will need to be satisfied there's an institutional policy framework to maintain and support academic integrity of students and staff. So TEXA makes that clear, it's not just about students. And in my work with TEXA, I have the fun task often of assisting TEXA when we have to do an accreditation or an assessment of an institution. And that's what I'm looking at. And I see, and based on my research as well over many years, most institutions have a lovely policy framework. They do. But it just doesn't stop there. It seems like everybody stops there, and they stop there at students. But what TEXA is asking all of us to do, that is, it has to be backed up by processes and practices that implement that policy effectively. And I do see often that's what's lacking, especially when we talk to staff. So the policy might have this amazing process that it articulates on paper, but in practice it just doesn't happen. And staff can become pretty disillusioned pretty quickly when they see that the policy is empty words. On top of having that policy framework for staff and students, providers need processes for detecting and addressing instances of plagiarism and other forms of cheating. Again, that's a place where often there's a real gap right across the sector. TEXA talks about it again in other standards, which we'll talk about. But before I talk about Section 7, Section 6.3 is on academic governance. And often I think people don't make the link between this policy framework and what happens at the very top. When we think about academic governance, we're often thinking about academic board. So good academic governance makes it clear that academic bodies of the provider are responsible for maintaining oversight of academic and research integrity, including the monitoring of potential risks. Again, in my work, what I do see is that certain bodies within universities and providers provide an annual report to academic board or its equivalent, Senate. Does anybody want to have a guess in the minutes of academic board what the response usually is to that? When they get the report at academic board, what do they say in the minutes? Received, noted. That's it. But when I look at that report that might have been sent to academic board, it might be full of inconsistencies that don't in any way enact effectively the policy framework. For example, it might say in the policy framework, substantiated cases of serious breaches such as contract cheating will go through this process, and maybe the outcome's supposed to be, let's say, a suspension or a 0 or something. But when I see that report that goes to academic board, often it's like all those cases got a warning, or they got a resubmit. And my question as an outsider then, as someone interrogating that document, is why the misfit? There may be a good reason for that misfit. Maybe there's a whole bunch of reasons, I don't know. It's not in the report. So I think if we want to really talk about implementing these standards, we need to provide adequate training for people as part of our governance, so they understand it's not just received, it's not just noted. They say, well, hey, how does this work? Or how come we had so many cases of X in this course? Or what's happening over here where we had no reports of any breaches, but we had thousands over here and none here? How does that happen? But we don't see that sort of interrogation, that critical interrogation. And we need to have it if we're going to effectively implement the policy. So don't get stuck here. We need to be following all the way, because academic board or our governance body is responsible for monitoring potential risks. It stops with them. And then in 7.2, this is an interesting one too, information for prospective and current students, not just current, prospective. Students coming to us requires providers to make information on and expectations of academic integrity available to students before they accept their offer. How many of us do that? If we're trying to build a culture of integrity, we need the people coming into our institution to understand the expectations. And I would say we need to do the same for staff. If you're going to come and work at my institution, these are the expectations. This is how we define and promote academic integrity. As a member of this community, you'll be expected to do the same thing. And 7.3.3c really continues on from this stuff around here, around detecting and addressing breaches. It says, It also obliges providers to document and record responses to allegations of misconduct and breaches. This can be the basis for analysis and identification of recurring issues. So often we think that we're just recording breaches so that if a student comes back into the system, we can go, oh, you've had 2 prior breaches, now we go to step 3 of our policy, or, now we know you can't say you don't understand. But in fact, TEX is asking for something much more than just monitoring of students. They're talking about analysis and identification of recurring issues. Like, why is it that we have this stuff happening over and over? Because no one's doing this, no one's actually really checking. So these are the standards that TEXA requires all of us to adhere to. And we could think, well, it's just a compliance thing, we just got to tick that box. But it isn't about compliance. This is actually based on international best practice as a guidance, really, to say how we're going to implement academic integrity. So the key lesson from this slide is, let's not just stop at policy, and let's not just think this is an issue for students. Let's really think about how we implement that policy effectively right across all stakeholder groups. Does everybody know about the model statement of commitment to academic integrity? The model statement came from a recommendation from the Department of Education and Training, because they've been taking some amazing leadership on this. We'll talk some more about that later through the Higher Education Standards panel, and also feedback from the sector. And a working group was convened, and I was very fortunately asked to be on that working group, but I'll be honest, I was really ambivalent. I was like, a model statement, because the original thing was a model statement of student commitment to academic integrity. And I'm like, well, it's missing some key people here. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll go. And I did, and I was really pleasantly surprised, because the working group comprised really diverse stakeholders representing universities, independent providers, peak bodies, and the key thing was student organisations with some really outspoken and articulate student leaders. And that was the first thing they said too. How come it's a commitment of student commitment? What about everybody else? You're asking us to do stuff, but what are you doing? And I was like, thank you so much. And I thought, oh, this is going well. So we've had a couple of all-day meetings in Canberra where they've thrashed it out. There's also been some face-to-face consultation, focus groups around the country to develop that statement. And it was originally conceived of as similar to your West-styled honour pledge. I pledge allegiance to. That's another reason I was a bit ambivalent, because the research shows in Australia we don't like that idea. Honour pledges are not for us. That doesn't mean we don't care about integrity, we just don't want to do that thing. So I was like, that's not going to work. So while it was conceived of that to begin, it's really been reconceived and redesigned to express mutual commitment to academic integrity by everybody. Sort of everybody's business approach, which is fantastic. It's a very different statement than the one they originally conceived of. It does focus on those values of honesty, trust, respect, fairness and responsibility, but also about practices and shared responsibilities and consequences, remember that definition, for individuals and institutions. And it's a model statement, that's all it is. It's not supposed to be something that you have to use. It's not a template that you have to use exactly. It's like, if you had a blank piece of paper, it's hard to get started. You can have this one and go, right, how does this apply to my setting? How would our policy framework articulate this based on this? It suggests, for example, it might be signed either metaphorically or literally by a DVCA or a VC, but you might decide the Dean Academic in each of your faculties signs it. Or it doesn't get signed. Some smaller institutions are like, we really like the idea of like a commencement ceremony where people come and make that commitment. That's their choice. So you can implement this model statement as you wish, according to your policy framework, but you don't have a blank page. And it has been collegially developed with students. And it's more than just about students' responsibilities. The other lovely thing is it's more than just a piece of paper. Just as our workshops are more than just a couple of hours with our colleagues, it's going to be complemented by resources and ongoing dialogue. So I love this leadership. I started very ambivalent, but I actually think this is the sort of leadership we need, and it's about developing shared understandings across the sector. So important when we think that students are articulating through various different pathways, coming in at different points in their study, if we all have this shared statement. I like it very much, so keep an eye out for it. It should come into your inbox by the end of the year, I'm hoping, because I have seen a very almost ready draft. So, our first discussion, every discussion will be 5 minutes where you talk in your groups, and then we'll have 5 minutes coming back to the whole group. So I want you to think about, and here's the thing that so many people think about, how it's defined, but I want to know how is it defined and how is it promoted at your institution? What do you do to promote that idea of integrity? 5 minutes. This is the dense bit. I'll try not to be too boring. There is a lot of research about the prevalence of cheating generally. And it started a long time ago in the 60s. William Bowers in the US had a big study based on 5,000 students and found that around half of those 5,000 students self-reported engaging in one or more of the various dishonest behaviours. That was in the 60s. Half the students said they were doing it. So that's where it started. More recent research, though, if we're looking at the last couple of decades, if we're talking about, this is general cheating, general dishonest behaviours of students, it can range from 46 to 72%. This is an Australian study. How we define the breach, how we ask the question, what the methodology is going to affect the data we get. So the numbers do vary very widely and wildly. Self-reported plagiarism tends to be higher, though it starts as low as 19 to 81. This is an Australian study. Now, I'm thinking about plagiarism for myself. If somebody asked me, had I ever plagiarised, is there anyone in the room who wouldn't say they had? I'm thinking it should be 100%, didn't we? Or have you ever cheated? I cheated when I was in grade 2. I looked over my shoulder at Magda Nicolatatis' spelling questions and she got them all right, and so did I for the first time ever. It's a very seminal moment for me because, yeah, I did that. But it taught me an amazing lesson as a 7-year-old because the teacher was like, Tracey Bretag, you've never got 10 out of 10 before. What happened? You know, I was a bit of a slack student until that point. And she's like lauding me. I was at the front of the room, you're fantastic, you're so great. But in my little heart, I'm like, I cheated, I lied. And what I took from that was, not that I'm going to keep cheating, but I thought, how hard can it be to do those 10 words? I'll do them myself, and then I'll get the legitimate praise later. And that had a big impact on me as an academic and a scholar. So I'm thinking it's like 100% of people who engage in something if the question is at any time. Often people think in the postgraduate space, we have less concerns. Anyone who teaches postgraduate coursework knows that cohort is virtually identical to our undergraduate coursework students, maybe with some more complications. Their mature age, they've had a big break, they didn't get all that training as an undergrad as well, so that number varies from here. This is actually, this 5% is about medical students cheating on their entrance exam on the statement they make about being a doctor. So even on something like that, right through to, this is coursework, 42%, again, the numbers vary. We're going to be talking about contract cheating today quite a bit because I know that's an issue across the sector that people really need guidance on. And despite the fears that the sky is falling in, the numbers are comparatively low around students outsourcing their work to third parties. Guy Curtis, who's on our team, and Joe Clare did a meta-analysis and found it ranges from 3.5 to 7.9%, depending on how you define it. That concurs fairly closely with our work based on the largest data set in the world, and I'm going to share a lot of that research today. 6% of our students self-reported engaging in outsourcing behaviours. For non-university providers, the number was pretty comparable, 7%. What was radically different about this group? Can I ask who is from a non-university provider, independent provider? The number's about the same, but our non-university students, our independent students, were 12 times more likely to say that they used a commercial provider than university students. University students, by and large, are still using family, friends, and people they know. In the independent sector, 12 times more likely to use a commercial provider. And we can chat throughout the day about why that may be so. I direct you to our paper we published on that this year where we have some ideas. And the only other sort of large study done in Czech Republic, of all places, with our colleagues there at the European Network for Academic Integrity, they found 8%. So this looks about right. So it's not like this, it's not 81%, it's not 72%, right? So we don't have half the class or more engaging in outsourcing. But we do have, in a group like this, say this is your average tutorial maybe, at least a couple of students who are engaging in this behaviour. Who they are and how they influence others is the cause for concern. The research around who cheats generally, males, Now there's some hypotheses around that. It could be that males are more honest when they self-report. We women are socialised to be like, oh, we shouldn't do that. So males self-report more, but recent research is starting to change that outcome a little bit. Women are starting to say they also engage in cheating behaviours. But by and large, with some mixed results, males tend to self-report more. Younger students, now that does cross just about every survey that I've seen. 17 to 24, 25. Younger students self-report more. Business students, and I'll say here business and engineering, as a group we call these the cheating triumvirate. It's business, IT and engineering, or engineering, IT, business. It's going to be one of those combinations depending on the survey. If you're in a business faculty and you're despairing, don't. It's not your students, it's business. Or if you're in engineering, those students are more likely to cheat than any other discipline, to self-report cheating, but very particular types of cheating. Anyone want to have a guess what the type of cheating in engineering is? The key type of cheating in engineering is collusion. Getting somebody else's answers from a previous semester or another student. So engineering students do outsource their work, but they don't tend to do it to commercial providers. They do it amongst themselves. They use an old formula, a previous assessment. Somebody else in the group does it. If this is the group doing it, you allocate. You do the first week, you do the second. So they outsource it to each other. So yeah, there you go. And international English as an additional language students. Every piece of research on academic integrity and language and literacy over 2 decades has confirmed the fact that we know, there's no one in this room, I'm sure, if you teach, have any doubt about this, that our students who are struggling in a second language are more vulnerable to the persuasive features, and Christine's going to share this with you later, the persuasive features of those commercial providers. More likely to outsource their work, more likely to plagiarise. It's not because they think it's okay, it's because they can't do the work. Now, it is absolutely conclusive. We need to be speaking to senior stakeholders, decision makers, policy makers, admissions processors, and say an IELTS of 6, according to IELTS, is woefully inadequate for academic study. So the fact that it's 6 across the sector has to change, it has to be raised. We would be so lucky if our students came in on a 6. They're coming in on so many different various pathways. I see students so often in academic integrity investigations who cannot have a conversation with me, and they tell me they got a 4.5. If anyone knows about IELTS, you can't construct a coherent sentence on that. You wouldn't be able to get through high school, probably not primary school, and somehow they're in the system. So again, that's a key message. We need to be fighting for the rights of our students to have appropriate language so they can achieve their potential, and not be blaming them for their cheating, because that's what always happens. It becomes about blaming international students. It's not about that. It's about ensuring they can achieve their learning potential, and we need to raise the standard for them if we care about them. It's conclusive. But you are not alone. In fact, you're so far from alone. Australians have led the way on academic integrity research for many years because of the Bowers research in the US. There was a really big US push on cheating behaviours. But in the last 20 years, Australian scholars have absolutely led the world. We started with the first conference on the topic, which ran every 2 years until 2017, not running this year, and I think it's because most of the higher education conferences have an academic integrity stream now. It's like it's embedded everywhere. I can only hypothesise that's why. The Asia Pacific Forum was very instrumental in those conferences. We set up the International Journal for Educational Integrity 2005. That's now published by Springer Nature, so it's actually really gained a lot of traction. The Academic Integrity Standards Project, and I've got links to these projects at the end of the slides. In that project, we analysed the policies, and I'm going to share that analysis with you, the policies of the 40 universities at the time, 2010 to 12, and we also ran a very large survey trying to understand what students need to know in terms of education around academic integrity. Have a look at Teach Us How to Do It Properly. That's a paper we published from that. After that, we had a year's funding to do the Exemplary Academic Integrity Project. That project aimed to develop a plain English definition of academic integrity, which is what we're now using. It also wanted to address the needs of 2 stakeholder groups that we identified as being under-supported. The first one was, no surprise, international EAL students, but also, perhaps surprising for some, postgraduate research students said they felt they were the least supported, the least satisfied with the support they receive around this topic. So we developed resources for them, and we also developed for the independent providers in the room who are perhaps struggling with defining and developing good policy. We developed software, which is still on our website, to help you develop a really best practice policy. It's software which you just key into things, you can look at good practice, you can look at examples, you get advice. You go to the end, it spits it out as a Word document, not the end, but you then take that to your committee and say, right, okay, now what are we going to do with this? To help people who perhaps didn't have a policy framework. There have been lots of other research projects. At Victoria, they looked at the role of the unit coordinator to promote academic integrity. At Macquarie, they explored whether honour codes would be a useful thing, and they had some pretty good data. Over 4,000 students emphatically said no. Newcastle University did some great research on non-text-based plagiarism, because so often we think about text, but they were looking at creative industries, computer science and so on. This year in March, with my colleague Rowena Harper and others, we completed the Contract Cheating and Assessment Design project. It's probably been our biggest to date. I'm going to share a lot of those findings with you. But other researchers around the country have done brilliant work. Wendy Sutherland-Smith and Phil Dawson at Deakin have been looking at the role as a marker and how you train the marker to identify contract cheating, along with Lisa Lyons. Christine's colleague, Susan Rowland, and her and others looked at the persuasive features of contract cheating sites, which Christine will share with you. Our colleague Guy Curtis and Jo Clare and Kiara Rundle have been looking at why students choose not to cheat. I'll share that data with you today. We've got great colleagues at Curtin, Leslie Sefkick and John York as well, really looking at policy and how to educate students and staff. There's more. They're the big ones. In 2016, we published the Handbook of Academic Integrity. It's a huge volume. If you want to buy it, you can use it as a doorstop, or you can just download it from your library. But it does have, it's huge. It's 1,100 pages with 90 authors who've contributed from around the world. So if you're looking for one source to have your academic integrity education, there it is. This year, I was the lead advisor for Oxford University Press EpiGM Academic Integrity Training for staff and students. I have no vested interest in promoting this other than to say if you don't have a training program, or you want to reinvigorate the one you've got, or you want to think about what to do for staff, why don't you ask for a 2-week sticky beak? Have a look at that. I'm not suggesting you have to buy it. It's probably a lot cheaper to buy it off the shelf and adapt it to your context if you don't already have one, but it's worth looking at. And in 2 weeks, to the publisher goes the next book, which is a research agenda for academic integrity, which is looking at some of the emerging threats. Contract cheating is one of them. I'm not going to get a chance today to talk to you about paraphrasing tools and translation tools and editing tools. That's actually a pretty big threat, along with things like cybersecurity. In today's small session, we won't cover it, but the book does. So there are a lot of colleagues around the country who can be a great resource for you. You're not on your own. Now, very briefly, I just want to take you through the context for academic integrity research, particularly our focus on contract cheating over the last few years. Does everyone remember the MyMaster scandal, 2015? Anybody not know what MyMaster is about? Very briefly, the Fairfax media identified hundreds of students who'd been using the commercial provider MyMaster. And it was on the front page of all the papers on the eastern states. The rest of the country was just going, you know, we knew it was happening everywhere. I remember Julie Hare from The Australian calling me and saying, Tracey, do you know there's this thing where students pay providers to write their essays? I'm like, yeah, I do. And she's like, well, what's happening? And at that time, I felt pretty disempowered myself. I'm like, I don't know what to do. We don't know how to prove it. We've got no policy and process in place for that. You know, no, I don't know. And really, that was a huge impetus for TEXA to start to take a lead. So I've often said in many forums, I like a good scandal, as long as my university is not on the front. It could happen to any one of us, though, because the scandal often does precipitate action, and that really has happened in Australia. Around the same time, there was a similar scandal around fake testimers. So students just buying their parchments, forget about buying their essays or their assignments, just go straight for the whole thing, right? And they were ones with the embossing and the watermark and the authentic signature of the VC on them. So someone from the inside was providing that. You might remember that ICAC did an investigation of corruption in higher education. If you haven't, if it sort of slipped by, I did a little conversation piece on that, which gives you a summary of it in 2016. You can have a look. Really, that investigation was around corruption at every point in the IELTS examinations, in the recruitment agents overseas. It was really a great investigation. And as a result, Texas said to everybody across the sector, hey, tell us what you're doing. What are you doing in response to these threats? And I was very fortunate when I first started working with Texas to look at those responses, because they were like, well, what do you think? Are people doing a good job? And what I could say is there were pockets of excellent practice across the sector. And there were pockets of excellent practice in one discipline but not in another within an institution. But there wasn't a coherent approach. And there were some pockets of really poor practice as well that people were doing naively, not realising it wasn't ideal. So that was interesting. Has everyone seen the SBS Pens for Hire documentary? Please have a look, it's still online. It was very influential to Rowena Harper and I as we did our research. So often we focus on bad students, on the cheaters, and we get angry at those cheaters. What this documentary did, which I think was very useful, was it showed the systemic problems that might lead a student to cheating. And there was an interview with one student, I believe he was from China, he was a business student, and he said, I came to Australia, I was so proud of myself, I got an IELTS of 6. That's an effortful and long process, anyone who knows a second language, this is not a small thing. And I got accepted into my program and my family was so proud of me and I was going to go back and be this, great person. I'm the only child in my family. But in the first semester, this student failed every assessment. Not just failed 45 to 49, failed. Didn't get through anything. And not one person reached out to him. Not one person said, hey, what's going on? Are you okay? How can we help you? We need to come. Nobody rang him, nobody emailed him. He did get a letter telling him he was on probation though, and he's in trouble. That was it. And he said at the end of that semester, he had come to the conclusion that the only way he was not going to let down his family, because he's already accrued a huge debt in one semester, you can imagine, was to go get a job in hospitality or something and pay someone to be him. And that's what he did for the rest of his degree. Somebody else was him. Changed all the ID. That other person sat in class. So this poor guy, who was the great hope of his family and his community, got nothing out of this hugely expensive education. He may as well have just gone and bought the fake test from online. So that was devastating for him, but it's something we need to keep in mind when we're doing this work. Our students are not behaving in these ways because they came to Australia wanting to do that. They find themselves often in a situation outside of their control. Doesn't mean we don't have consequences for it, but we can have some compassion along with those consequences. I think you probably all remember too, around the same time, there were lots of fraudulent practices in the vet sector with ghost students, people going out, for example, into the APY lands and offering marijuana and alcohol and iPads and iPhones to enrol in an online course they were never going to do and just accrue a huge debt. That made big media headlines. We've all been worried about low admission standards for some time, and the whole soft marking thing comes up time and time again. Airtasker was another scandal. In 2017, Airtasker is an outsourcing provider of say you want someone to pick your dry cleaning up or walk your dog. You can get someone to come over. It's just a great little idea in this gig economy. Maybe not good for those people, I don't know. But there were some professional writers who work with businesses. So they contacted Texas and said, we've got all these students asking us to write their essays. That's not what we want to do. And Texas was like, what? Okay, here we go again. And then in 2018, it was a very big news in the UK. Not such big news in Australia. Who knows about the EduBirdie scandal? Almost no one. EduBirdie, if you look it up, it's a cute little, like a little yellow bird, like a little animation. And it's the face of a contract cheating site, a commercial site. What makes this particularly problematic is EduBirdie was using people who do YouTube videos. Anybody got any tweens here? Like 11, 12, 13-year-olds? Hands up if you've got anyone like that in your life. No one? Oh yeah, okay. They love YouTube. I don't know if, yeah, right, they love YouTube. I don't know what it is. And, they're watching some of those crazy things, those antics. Back in the day, 20 years ago, it was like Jackass, right? So there's people having these fun things doing this thing, and they stop in the middle of it and they go, hey, you having fun? You don't really want to do your homework, do you? Keep in mind they're talking to 12, 13-year-olds, 11, 12, 13. How about you give it to the nerds at EduBirdie? They'll do it for you and you can keep watching YouTube and having fun. Now, what was pretty shocking about that is that they're targeting these children who are not even in high school with this cute little, innocuous little yellow bird, and making those children feel like it's not a legitimate thing to do your study. Now, it made big news in the UK because there was some intervention and the government got involved and they took those infomercials down, but not before over 700 million people had viewed it, which is a very large number. So you can see I'm out of space. If I come and talk to you next year, I'll have another slide. Maybe there'll be another scandal. There will be another scandal, and none of us want our institutions to be enmeshed in that. But like I said before, every time we see somebody else in a scandal, it could happen to us. And these are the sorts of environments we're in the last few years. Most of you have seen all sorts of advertisements around contract cheating. This is like a homemade one. The reason it was very influential on my work is, if there are Chinese speakers in the room, do correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand this is saying to our very vulnerable students, we know Chinese students are struggling, we'll do your work for you, okay, standard stuff. But this one here, I thought it said, we'll give you an HD or a D. No. They're saying, are you a D or an HD student? Would you like to be a ghostwriter? So they're not just seducing our vulnerable students to cheat, they're corrupting our good students. And this very homemade poster was on our campus like it had been like a helicopter drop on the day we came in. It was on every seat and on the cafes and in the lecture theatres and on the backs of toilet doors. And this is around 2015, around the My Master scandal, and we realised we're not providing a counter message to that. I wasn't allowed to put things on the back of the toilet door, but they don't go to Campus Central and check if they're allowed. I'm like, oh, can I put this up on this notice board? They're not asking that. So we weren't providing a counter message to this, huge, big advertising drop. We also weren't engaging staff in pulling all those posters down. They sat there for days. And you see this sort of stuff around town on, columns. You see little homegrown editors offering content. So that's cheating. They think they're not doing that, but they are. You've got file sharing sites like Course Hero and Sudoku and ThinkSwap. Now, in our own research, we didn't classify them as cheating sources, cheating sites, because you're only cheating when you submit work for assessment and get credit for it. These you can upload an assignment, and then you can download something else for free. For a premium, you pay some money, you can just go in there and look. Now, I can find my own course. You'll find your university. Look at this. This is even an attempt to use our logo to make it look very legitimate. Go find your university or your provider. You'll find your course. You'll find the assignment that you just uploaded to the LMS last week. It'll be there. And students will be uploading assignments from semesters before. Now, why do we worry about people sharing? We have had people in the media saying that's what students have always done. They've always shared their work. Why are you worried? Our hypothesis was that this was a slippery slope towards cheating services, especially when they're doing things like plagiarism-free writing service. How does that work if it's just a file sharing site? They have little AI bots that come up. Chris is going to share with you that later. But our hypothesis was that when you get engaged in sharing like that and looking for other people's work, you're taking a transactional approach to your learning. And we thought that would be a slippery slope towards cheating. And it was. Our cheating students were twice as likely to also use file sharing sites. 15% of students use file sharing sites. 27% of the students in our sample shared their work with others for any reason, but only 6% engaged in the clear cheating behaviours, but 15% are using these sites. Twice as likely to also cheat. And you can go on this, and there's thousands of them. In the good practice note for Texter, I suggested that these sites should be blocked. We blocked them at UniSA, and ideally you should also have a little link there saying this is not a legitimate learning service. I give you the words in the good practice note. If you want to get help, go to our Learning Support Centre. If you want to get 24/7 support, go to Studiosity if you use it, or some other service. If you want to get help, talk to your tutor, go to class. Go to your Moodle site. You'll probably find everything you need there. So again, we've got these sites infiltrating our students' social media. I mean really infiltrating. I've had students say to me 4 or 5 times a day they get these messages around these sites, whether it's a clear commercial provider or a file sharing site 4 or 5 times a day in WeChat, in Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, even email. They actually target our students. I don't know how they get that email address, but then how do they get any of this information? So we need to provide a counter message and send our students to the learning support they need. And they're wanting it 24/7. Are we giving it to them? So I've mentioned the good practice note, which is freely available on the Texas site. It's all about how do you address this threat of contract cheating. It takes you through each of the standards and then provides an example from a provider who's doing a pretty good job. Like I said, we could identify really good practice around the sector, but we need to share that with each other. You'll find that there. I mentioned before the Department of Education and Training taking a real leadership and the Higher Education Standards Panel on, for example, the model statement of commitment, but also about making those commercial providers of contract cheating services illegal with real consequences. No one believes that's going to solve the problem or be easy to prosecute, but it's one thing we can do. And I, for one, am very happy that it's happening. I mentioned the large survey we did, the largest survey in the world. So we have an awful lot of data that you can draw on from, and it's published in Studies in Higher Ed. We also have a lot of data from staff telling us about their experience. I mentioned Phil and Wendy's work on markers and how to train them to detect contract cheating. I've mentioned Susan and Christine's work and their colleagues on the persuasive features of those websites. The International Journal ran a thematic collection. There are 7 articles in one place that all got published in about an 18-month period. So there's more work, and that's all freely available, open access. So all of this stuff is there. But of course it's really hard because each of those articles is like, 20 or 30 pages. So what we have committed to do, we have developed a double-sided A4 page summarising the key things to keep in your mind. And all of the research that we did on the contract cheating work, we were committed to doing the same thing. Okay, you can go read all these articles or you can go to our website, and we have summarised the key things in just a double-sided A4 sheet so you can hand that to your staff, stick it on your billboard. So just before we proceed, of course, we need to make sure we're all on the same page about what it means. We do have different definitions. This is how Rowena Harper and I defined it in our staff paper. Contract cheating occurs when a student submits work that has been completed for them by a third party, irrespective of the third party's relationship with the student and whether they're paid or not. Now, our colleague Guy Curtis tends to use a definition which is about commercial providers. We chose not to, and I'll tell you why. When students pay for it, it hurts us in a way that we can hardly articulate. It just seems like the worst thing you can do to pay someone to do your learning, because that means you get nothing. But what are we really upset about? Are we upset about the fact that money is exchanged? Or are we upset about the fact that students are coming to the university or to the institution and not engaging in their learning? They're getting credit for work they haven't done. They're going to graduate having not achieved the learning outcomes and be a threat to professional practice and to society. That's the bottom line. Because what we are is educators. We are here to educate our students, they're here to learn, and if they're not learning, that is the problem. So outsourcing it to somebody else, the outcome is the same. We also collected data. We're also interested in when people pay or not, and so we have that data as well. But for us, the bottom line, the threat to academic integrity is the same, whether you pay for it or you don't. So that's the definition we use. That third party could be a friend or family member, another student or a staff member. We had heard anecdotally that staff were doing this, people who perhaps were sessional or didn't have a job or retired. We found very tiny evidence of that. That was not a big issue. A few people in our 1,200 odd said they had done it, but it was not a big deal. It was a handful. So you can rest easy on that, or it might be a commercial service. Our colleague Guy Curtis put together this little pie chart based on some key research to say, what is the prevalence of contract cheating? Well, in our research, these 2 things come from our study. Around 2%, I think it was 2.3, said they buy it, they pay for it, but another 4% said they outsource it to friends, family, former students. So there's the 6% that are outsourcing it according to our study. In another study that was done in the UK before we collected our data by Rigby et al., they had 90 students. They sort of locked them in a room. They used a qualitative approach, and they gave them a bunch of different scenarios. So Christine, would you be prepared to pay for it if, your children were sick and you were in hospital the night before? And you'd be like, no. Well, what if your children were sick and in hospital the night before and your dog got run over the next morning? And what if your girlfriend left you? They gave them all these scenarios, right? 50% said no matter what you give me, no matter what the scenario, I will not do it. Because I want to learn and I think it's wrong. So that's great. 50% of our students would never do it. Guy's calling this group here, because we've got the cheating group. He says they're cheat curious. I don't know if they're cheat curious. Maybe they're strategic, depending on the scenario, depending on the situation. And we know that ourselves. There's 1,000 things we wouldn't do, but put us in enough of a tight spot, maybe we'd consider it. And I guess it's this 44% that we really need to educate. Because when we know they're going to be in some tight spots, we know they're going to have challenges, we know they're going to have anxiety and so on. What are we doing to forestall that, to prevent that from happening? This group's never going to do it. This is the group we're worried about. This comes from our data, and very, very briefly, it supports other work. Males more likely to self-report engaging in contract cheating. Engineering, twice as represented in the group. International and second language learners, they're not the same group, they overlap substantially, but second language was the big thing that came out in the study, and it wasn't just international, although they're overrepresented too. I've circled this to show, look, that's not significant. Slightly more likely if you're an internal student. Why does that matter? These guys are underrepresented. Many of us are worried about external, fully online students. In fact, and this supports other data as well, totally online external students are less likely to self-report engaging in cheating. Why might that be? They're older. They're not the young group. They might be doing just part-time work, one subject or unit at a time. They're intrinsically motivated. They're doing it after they've worked and put the kids to bed at 10 o'clock at night. They don't have the social networks of the people on campus. And they may be, because they're older, they're not getting inundated in the same way on social media as well. And because we're worried about that group, we put a lot of security in place. We all use online proctoring, authentication of students' identity and so on. So we put the security in place. They're a different cohort. We don't need to worry about these guys so much. We do need to worry about the students on campus who are sharing a lot. I've put this in here. At the time we were doing our research, some very senior members of staff from some group of 8 universities were on the front page of the paper saying, look, that might be happening over there in those ones. But for us, we have high integrity at our institution, very, very, motivated students. Wouldn't happen here. So we were very interested to explore that. It looks like we are great researchers. We're not. It just was random that we got a 50-50 split, but we did. And what we found, in fact, in the G08, they were slightly more likely to engage in contract cheating behaviours. It wasn't statistically significant. But it does show, look, it's happening everywhere, whether you're a small private provider, whether you're a well-established G08, whether you're an ATN, no one is immune from this. That's the message. I'm going to pass to Christine to share with you her research.
So I can assure you I'm from the University of Queensland, which is one of the G08s, and we do take this very seriously. We've actually got a draft academic integrity plan that covers lots of different aspects, which we're starting to implement now. But this was a little bit earlier, and it comes from an article that Professor Susan Rowland and I wrote with 2 undergrad science students. So it was a Students as Partners research project, and they had the job of looking at, through different browsers, a set of criteria, what were the most common contract cheating sites that came up on the search. And then we took the key 11, I think it was supposed to be 10, but for some reason we have 11 because of something being similar. And then we looked at a framework by Diaz and Kutra from 2013, which actually was from hospitality, but it was a persuasive marketing kind of framework, and so we applied that because it was very similar. I mean, if you've seen these sites, they use the most up-to-date marketing persuasive features to get our students to engage. So this little wordle over here Just gives an example of what you can actually buy on these sites that we looked into. So we're only letting the students look at the front page because we didn't want their names inside one of these sites. But from the front, there was all different types of sites. Some of them were very general and you could get lots of things from an essay through to an oral presentation. You can get a thesis proposal. You can actually get your thesis. Everything pretty much except a video of yourself actually presenting something. There were other sites that actually were very specific, so they might be related to business, for example. And I know my son did accounting and he actually used to have textbooks that had quite complicated case studies that you could do online. These sites can actually have those types of things as well, so they know someone could buy that to have their answers. Then this part here was actually how much does it cost? And that probably was one of the most astounding things. It's definitely cheaper to buy something to pass your course than actually redo the course. So it's basically on what you want per one page, there's a cost per one page, and how quickly you want it. So if you've got 2 weeks and you want your assignment, you'll be over on this side over here, and we found that the cheapest based on one page would be 2 weeks, and it cost you just under $12 a page. But if you've been very disorganised and something's sort of, you're now the night before or something like that, it goes up very steeply. So now for your one page, I think the most expensive one was $53, average around $47. So you can see you can actually get everything, along this whole time frame. They're the actual sites. The other part of it, which was quite alarming, is we analysed the persuasive features that they had. So just on the front page, we're not going inside of this. So they have the live chat. So Susan was engaging with the bot, and it was all right for a while, and then they couldn't really answer it. By then, though, they've got the student actually engaging into the site. I mean, we obviously weren't doing that at that time. They offer discounts for first-time use. So another attractive, general marketing tool. They have a privacy policy. They have a link to About Us. So all the time they're giving them the good vibes of, we're okay, we can help you, it's all right to take help from us. You have an ordering button. So actually, Tracey had it on the slide before, but it was like a tumbler. You put in, like when you're getting accommodation or something like that, and you put in what you want and when you want it, and sometimes what sort of quality you want, and it'll tumble the price for you. So it's pretty easy to find out. They assure you by different words they use that it's going to be good quality work. Plagiarism free. You even get a Turnitin report. So that calms the nerves of what you're doing. 24/7 help, so if something goes wrong. Money back guarantee, they say that, but I'm not sure about that. And then the testimonials, so we use people with usually actually Caucasian pictures of people looking very happy, saying this was great to use this site, I would use it again, all of that type of thing. Affordability, you can work out what you can afford, they'll show you that. How to get it, delivery mode. So this was the types of things we analysed it by, and it's a bit hard to read obviously, but reciprocity, involvement, credibility, usability, about the information, and there's a whole lot of subsections. But in summary, really to say, what we were concerned about is students falling into this because of the persuasive nature and the situational ethics involved, that students, depending on how desperate they get for what they want, that they would start to believe these messages and then find themselves in a difficult situation.
Great, thanks. We encourage you to go on and have a look at those sites, but the analysis has been done for you. They are incredibly persuasive. So very briefly, Guy, our colleague, is a psychologist and a criminologist, so he's very interested in motivations, and his research, he pulled it all together for us to show these key things. He's calling them controllable factors that are associated with plagiarism and other academic integrity breaches. So these are things that universities and institutions can respond to. It's lack of understanding, by and large, that students engage, particularly in plagiarism, and our research supports that 100%. The perceived seriousness. If you don't think it's serious, you don't think it really matters, or perhaps you've been given a mixed message before, as we talked about with UDEM in Mexico, like this really matters, but nothing happens if you breach. Perceived norms, which is why that 6 to 8% in your classroom, you don't want them to, and that 44% cheat curious, you don't want them to become thinking this is how it has to be now. The Lance Armstrong effect, I couldn't compete on a level playing field unless I cheated too. I've belaboured that point. I could talk a lot about language proficiency, but it isn't just international students, it's our domestic second language learners too. Poor time management and procrastination, we know that. Opportunities, I'll share with you some multivariate analysis from our large data set that confirms that as well. When students are constantly bombarded with opportunities, not only do they think it's normal and what everyone's doing, but just like opportunities are presented to them all the time. Lack of support for integrity, which sort of goes down to this around students' perceptions of staff apathy, lack of dedication. Now this can happen, for example, I see this a lot, where students are getting distinctions and high distinctions in all their work, but they've got like an 80 or 90% text match on the Turnitin score, or the other program if you're using Urkund or whatever. So students start to go, well, no one's actually checking that. No one cares. I'm getting a good grade, so I'll just keep doing that. That's quick and easy. So they start to think that staff don't care. We'll talk about that later. Staff need time and resources to check those reports, which follows down to no fear of consequences. If no one's checking, you're just going to keep doing it. Our research found student dissatisfaction with the teaching and learning environment when they feel they're just a number, when no one knows them, when no one cares, when no one follows up. Remember that student in the SBS Pens for Hire program. Pressures and life complexity. Now these are things we can respond to, is our point. We know about this from lots and lots of research. What are we as institutions doing to address those issues? I don't have the answers for you, but what I do know is it takes resources. Takes staff. You can't have 4 or 5 learning advisors for an institution of 50,000 students and think that students are going to get the support they need here, or reduce your semester down to 10 weeks with no language and literacy embedded in the curriculum because you've got no time for it anymore, or have 35 students in a tutorial instead of 15 or 20, or worse, have a 50-minute tutorial instead of a 2-hour tutorial. All of these things can be addressed, but they require really rethinking our teaching and learning environment and resourcing it. Then there's some things around individuals that perhaps we have less control over, whether they just don't care about their learning, low conscientiousness, hard for us to deal with that. Anxiety might be something we can assist with, and it's more than just patting a puppy before the exam. Although I love patting puppies, I do. We have an academic integrity dog at my university, and it's a great crowd puller. So I like that, but it's not going to solve some of the really deep problems our students have. Low self-control, a competitive mindset, impulsivity, low confidence, and poor resilience. I mean, these are some of the things that are perhaps outside of our control, although we might consider them as well. I mentioned that Kiara Rundle and colleagues have been looking at why students don't cheat, looking at the positive side. Now these are listed in order of significance based on their work. The first one, you'll be happy to know, that's that 44, or maybe that's the 50% rather. They just want to learn. They're like, I'm here to learn, I wouldn't consider cheating, and I think it's wrong. And these two pretty much trump everything else. They're the top ones. But other things around institutional factors is the third one. They talked about respecting their teachers. And here's an interesting, simple thing we could do. Students don't cheat when they can get extensions. What that means is when their teachers show them some compassion. We have seen students who applied for an extension 24 hours before or something, and the teacher said, you need a med cert, otherwise I can't give it to you. What did the student do then? They got a fake medical certificate. Now that's fraud. Now the student gets caught and they're suspended. This is a much more serious breach than, cutting and pasting a bit from the internet, right? So extensions are really important, compassionate, consistent extensions. If you've got a lot of students asking for extensions, give a global one. Again, it's very hard if you've got a very truncated study period to do that. But this, of course, is the flip side of why people cheat. Students don't cheat because they're frightened of getting caught. They don't trust the provider, and with good reason. Despite these assertions you'll get your money back, we see a very low quality. Wendy Sutherland Smith's done some work on this. Generally, the quality from those commercial providers is low, not least because students are asking them to do the work with so little notice. Now, if you ask me to do an assignment in 3 hours, I don't think I could guarantee the quality. I think I'd be cutting and pasting from sources, right? So these good students who wouldn't cheat say, look, I don't trust them, and they're right. And they say lack of opportunity, which is interesting. We do know our second language learners, our international students, are the ones whom are being bombarded by those cheat sites. So they see opportunity everywhere. So I showed you those demographic factors, males, young, online, face-to-face. All of those things are interesting, but when we did our multivariate analysis, we found, in fact, those demographics fell away. And these are the three things based on our survey of over 15,000 students from 8 universities and 4 independent providers. It's language, it's language, it's language. That trumps everything, trumps discipline, trumps assessment task. Goes right across. The second one, we've talked about this and that concurs with other research, is this idea there's lots of opportunities, which is why we have to care about these commercial providers bombarding our students. And the third one is the dissatisfaction with the teaching and learning environment. I'll talk some more about that later. But that is something where we need to put resources. Our cheating students are saying they're dissatisfied. They want to know their lecturer. They want to be able to approach us. They want more help. And when they're not getting it, it's a factor that influences their cheating behaviour. So, in the last 5 to 10 minutes before we have a coffee break and a bathroom break, I want you to think I've given you an awful lot of information about the findings about academic integrity, but specifically contract cheating. How does that resonate with your experience? And how's your institution responding to that issue? Remember, one of the standards that we need to adhere to is about policies and procedures to promote and uphold academic integrity. Promote and uphold. Now, I mentioned before that one of our research projects in 2010 to 12 was an analysis of the 40 university policies at that time. We had about, from memory, it's a while ago, I think there were 23 codes, and then we added a few more. It was close to 30 codes. We looked at every aspect you can think of the policy. And what we came up with at the end were 5 core elements of exemplary policy. If an institution had these 5, in no particular order, we considered it to be exemplary. And we've tried to illustrate this concept with a Solomon seal knot. I don't know if you know about knots, but a Solomon seal knot is a multi-stranded it's one strand with many aspects to it. So if you pull it together, it's tighter. It's not like you're putting 5 ropes together, it's one rope. So the other thing about these 5 core elements is you can have all of these, but if you don't have a commitment to a culture of academic integrity at the centre, again, it's just empty, wasted paper. So I'm going to start with the top one, not because it's the first, but it's the first one we think of. When we did this analysis in 2010 to 12, what we found is it was hard to find the policies. It was actually really hard to find. And a very simple thing for your institution, you should make sure that staff and students do a keyword search and all of its associated words, so academic integrity, plagiarism, cheating, misconduct, academic honesty, whatever words you want to associate with that, so get that right. They should put that in the search, and they should go to a landing page where it's all there for them, where all the academic integrity training is, where the policy is, where staff get advised on procedures, you name it. And I'm going to give you an example later from Griffith, who do a jolly good job of that. But so you've got to find it, and when you find it, you've got to be able to read it. So that sounds like such a simple thing, but we did a linguistic analysis of these policies, and in some cases you had to have a PhD. So complicated and so legalistic was the language. Now remember, this is going to take me to my second point in a second, we are educators, we're not lawyers, we're not trying to frighten our students, but they need to be able to find it, read it. It should be concise. They shouldn't have to read through that much information, and comprehensible. The second point is approach, which is where I was going to. You need a statement of purpose which has an educative focus up front and all throughout. So we see a lot of policies that they start straight away. Their preamble is, this university takes academic integrity very seriously, and any breach will be dealt with in the harshest possible terms. We have a no tolerance approach to misconduct. Now, any student who's gone to that policy is going to start flipping out. And remember, 50% of students would never cheat. Probably another 40-odd% don't cheat as well. We're talking to a small number of people who are engaged in cheating, but we're lumping everybody together. So it's got to be education first. and really think about your language. Legalistic language has no place, in my view, in an academic integrity policy, because remember, it's about teaching and learning. TEXA mentions this, and I've mentioned this right at the front. Academic integrity is a responsibility for everybody, and your policy document and your landing page for it should articulate those responsibilities very clearly. Fair enough if students feel you're asking more of me than you ask of yourselves. We want to see this as a shared endeavour, and when they see that we're all taking responsibility, I think it changes the dynamic. You need to provide detail, and I've said extensive but not excessive. So it's really hard to get that balance right. Griffith does a great job, I'll show you in a moment. If a student, for example, is called into a meeting, we'll talk about that in a second, and that's the first time they may have engaged with the policy. You send them the link, I'm sure. They go to that link, and they can't work out. In your letter you've said, you know, you're going to come and talk about plagiarism. Like, oh, gee, what is plagiarism? Okay. Oh, what's the definition? Or there's an issue around contract cheating or collusion. How do I find out what exactly that is? And then how do I find out what the anticipated outcome might be? Where's the information? And not just for students. When a staff member says, oh, I think I've spotted something, that might be the first time they engage with the policy, and they're not sure what even it is either. So extensive but not excessive detail. You don't want to try and articulate it for 5 pages. And this one goes back to that TEXA requirement. You can't have all this stuff if you're not demonstrating how you're implementing it. And that means embedded support for everybody to enable the implementation of the policy. And you can see how this paper came out before the TEXA requirements, and you can see how it's informed them. But you need this. If you don't have that already, there's no point talking about training staff. There's no point about talking to students. There's no point having an academic integrity training module because you don't have your policy in place. Everything starts with the policy. Otherwise, you're going to have students challenging you on your decisions, and they'll win. So this is the policy. You start with that, but then you have to implement it. How do you do that? So in our second project, the Exemplary Academic Integrity Project, we identified the universities that were doing just that, with those 5 exemplary elements of policy, and we invited them for 2 days. We locked them in a room, and for 2 days we asked them to tell us how they did it. And we recorded it, and then we transcribed it, and then we analysed it like research data, and we came up with this. What these universities all had in common was this. You can imagine how much I wanted it to be 5. 5 core elements, 5 ways to implement, and we ended up with 6, which is so challenging to represent it. But you start with the policy, and again, you have to be committed to this culture at the centre. Often what happens is people have a beautiful policy, maybe they've spent a lot of time consulting and developing it, and then they're like, job done. Or we'll review that in 5 years' time. That's the cycle for us. 5 years' time, a lot is happening in academic integrity. 5 years ago, we weren't even thinking about contract cheating. I've mentioned a couple of new threats like online paraphrasing and editing tools. We have constant threats. Things like, concerns about English language, concerns about new commercial providers, it goes on. 5 years is not a reasonable time to review. So you've got to keep on that. Every one of these institutions who did a good job talked about having academic integrity champions. Now, they talked about having them at the faculty level in the department or the school. They talked about having people, for example, academic integrity decision makers like AIOs, who really were championing at that level. But they also said that wasn't enough. So they can have conversations, they can promote it to colleagues, they can go and talk to students. But often people who are making breach decisions are not people with a lot of power. They all talked about having someone higher up. That means at least a dean academic. That means at least a DVCA or E or a provost. You've got to have someone at the top really pushing it. Without it, it's just lots of people banging their heads against a brick wall and feeling frustrated. The third one is academic integrity education for all stakeholders. And we've talked about that, having training modules. I'll show you some examples of those in a moment. So educating people, but then really partnering with students. And how could we do that? So that students don't feel we're just imposing upon them a policy that means nothing much to them. We need them to help you with developing it. That's why I like the new model statement. Those students were like, let me tell you. And they were really articulate and people listened and there was a sense of ownership at the end. It's very different than saying, we want you students to sign this statement of commitment to academic integrity. That's never going to work. So a collegially developed partnering process with students. Okay, so I mentioned about in Mexico, having all these great things is not enough unless you have real decision-making processes which are robust, consistent and fair. Now that starts with the policy, but then how you implement it, how you follow up on breaches, how you support students, and I'll give you some ideas about that in a moment as well. And then we also talked right at the beginning about those standards, those higher education standards. It's not just record keeping so that we can catch students out, it's about evaluation and quality assurance, improving our practice. Not about compliance, it's about improving what we do. So here's an example. Now again, this is from Griffith University. All of these examples come from the Good Practice Note, which you can download from the Texas site. And they very simply, and it looks like, oh, that'd be easy to do. It's actually really hard to get the words just right, to define something in a way which is simple, not complicated, easily accessible. Griffith is an outstanding example of good policy. So if you want to look at what that is, go and have a look at them. And here's an example in terms of, so that was about detail. This one's about access. This is their landing page. If you do an academic integrity search on their site, you just go straight to everything here. The student charter, the assessment policy, the submission and return procedures, everything. The misconduct policy for HDR candidates, don't forget them as well. You land here. Have a think about if you could do that. That's not simple, but it's one thing you could do working with ITS to help you do that. It should be the first thing. If you can't find what your policy and your education around it is, it's going to be very challenging to actually build a culture. I'm sure most people in the room use some form of technology. I just mentioned working closely with ITS, your technology people to help you. That's actually the first thing. They're a key stakeholder in academic integrity on a whole range of issues. But most of us have text matching software, for example. Does anybody not have text matching software at their institution? Everyone's got it. What I did find when I've looked at various universities and providers' use of text matching software, though, is it's very variable. Now, in my opinion, the only use of text matching software should be ubiquitous. Every assessment item should go through it. It shouldn't be a matter of choice for the staff member to say, oh, I'm concerned about that one, that looks a bit dodgy, I'll put it through or I'll get the student to. Because what happens then, this is absolutely what happens, is we start discriminating against those students who we can identify. Our second language learners, it's very clear when the language changes for them, so we put their work through, but in fact our domestic students might be cutting and pasting too, but we don't see it. So the best practice is to use your text matching software for every assessment. Also, you can't just stick it in there and think that staff know how to interpret it. So you need to spend real time and resources on it. Just putting the technology in there is not the answer. Also, best practice, in my opinion, is to allow students to use it themselves as a drafting tool. I know this is not uncontroversial. Some people feel uncomfortable about it. But are we trying to catch them plagiarise, or are we trying to help them develop academic integrity skills and academic literacies? You may have, you can only do it 3 times, or, a very authentic task might be put it through, turn it in, or Urkund, whichever one you use. Strike plagiarism, there's lots of text matching softwares. You might say put it through and then show that draft to me and show how you've improved it. That would be a really authentic task if you have time in your curriculum. But students should be able to use it. They need to be trained on how to interpret the results. I have seen many institutions say a blanket statement, any assessment with a 20% match or higher goes straight to the plagiarism officer. Makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to anybody, because if you think there's a magic number, there isn't. We would like life to be like that, for there to be a number that we can say this equals that. It's not like that. As academics, I encourage you to put your own work through Turnitin, and you'll see if you're citing the sources, if you're using references, if you're using the key concepts, you're going to have 10 or 20% anyway. So it's not the number, it's about how you interpret that similarity report. So students need to know, staff need to know, we need to think carefully about how we use it, and it has to be ubiquitous, and it has to be consistent across the disciplines. I think I've covered those things. Adequately resourcing staff. Now, I'm really happy this is being recorded, because we all know that about 80% of assessments are marked by casual staff, and they are woefully under-resourced to mark. They might get 20 minutes for a 2,000-word assignment, in my discipline, for example. 20 minutes for a 2,000-word assignment. In my discipline, for example. 20 minutes for a 2,000-word assignment. In my discipline, for example. 20 minutes for a 2,000-word assignment. In my discipline, for example. I can hardly read a 2,000 word assignment in 20 minutes meaningfully. Look at the complicated rubric to make sure all the requirements are met. Moderate against the other tutors who are marking as well. Upload the rubric and give meaningful feedback, because that's what students need, and check the Turnitin score to make sure there's no problem. So that's an issue. If we're not resourcing our staff, we can't blame them if they're not checking. I have staff say to me, look, I only get paid 20 minutes, but I spend an hour on it. I need an hour. These are people wrecking their physical and mental health and their time with their families, working endless hours, which is great, and we're grateful to them for it. But it's not sufficient, it's not adequate. If we want them to be able to use the technology, which is expensive and being provided, we need to train them, resource them and support them. Senior managers need to lead by example. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with what happens when a senior manager gets referred a case and they're like, oh, it's just too difficult, just give them 0. It's going to waste everybody's time, just give them 0. Now that's a problem, because you're going to have inconsistency for students. If you think it's a breach worthy of investigation, even if it's a minor breach where you can put in lots of educative support, the senior manager should support you. I think I've covered those points. I'll share some research in a moment, some data from our research around staff who do report and how the process is just impossible to follow, it takes too long, it's opaque, and then they don't feel like they're supported when they do. This is an example from Curtin University. I've mentioned Griffith is a great example, so is Curtin. What I love about Curtin is they do these very simple flowcharts, and it's available to both staff and students, so you can see what the process is. So this is for the marker, have you got this evidence? And they list the various types of evidence. What I love here is that it's like, at this point, stop. Don't keep marking. Why would you mark an assignment that you can clearly see has an 80% text match to a cheat site? Why would you give that a grade? Stop and refer it. In this case, they refer it to their unit coordinator. And then the process goes on. This is a continuation of that flow chart. And then it goes down, okay, so what happens here? What are the various things you take into consideration? Is there someone, they call them an authorised officer, the person who's the breach decision maker, and the various things that are going to happen. I love it because it's so simple, it's easy to read. I've seen flowcharts that are so complicated I got lost by the 3rd page because I couldn't work out where I was going. This is beautiful. Curtin does a great job. So, I've left this little graphic there for you to have a look at. You've got 5 minutes to have a think about it. Think about your own institution's academic integrity policy. That's the policy, the 5 core elements, and think about how it's implemented. What do you do? And don't be frightened to talk about it. What are you doing well? And where are the gaps? What could you improve upon? 5 minutes. Okay, so remember, one of the standards is actions to mitigate foreseeable risks to academic integrity. I love that word that Tracey uses, foreseeable risks. There are things we know that we can think about. So one of the first things, and we've got a very mixed group today in terms of the type of provider, we need to be thinking about academic integrity at all points of students' entry to higher ed. So that includes really starting at ELICOS centres, English language centres. It starts at the IELTS. It starts where students are thinking about coming to university. Are they getting the same consistent message? We've mentioned pathway providers, particularly they're linked so strongly to the policy environment of the university. And we know that that group, I mentioned before, 12 times more likely to report using a commercial provider. They're really vulnerable to those seductive advertising features that Christine shared with you, and other independent providers. So all of those. But we just need to ensure that students who've articulated into your institution have received the necessary training and education, and it's not a one-off thing. But especially those who receive block credit. We know we have students who come in the 2nd or the 3rd year or into postgraduate study and they missed it all. How do we reach them? So it isn't a one-off thing. I like the idea about, over the trimester, especially when you need it. Students are the same as staff. You don't know what you need until you've stuffed up, until you've seen something you don't understand. So often we do all that stuff in orientation and students don't even know what an assessment's going to look like. So it's just and same for staff. More actions, a range of preventative measures that take into account the student life cycle from pre-admission through to graduation. So, training for all staff. We've mentioned this, teachers. completely under-resourced, especially our casuals, our sessional staff. We have to keep fighting for them if we care. We just have to. Those of us who have continuing jobs or have a senior job, it's your responsibility. Don't leave those guys to fight for themselves. They've got insecure employment. They're scared they won't get another contract. Senior managers have such a critical role to play, and often I think this is just something they think has to get done. I've heard some senior managers say, oh, that's just such a dirty topic. We don't want to talk about that. That makes people uncomfortable. And I'm always like, how can speaking about integrity make you feel uncomfortable? You know, so we have to change the language around it and the attitude. Obviously, if you use the Oxford-Brooks model, that's an academic integrity breach decision-making model. Griffith does not use that, by the way. So I like the Oxford-Brooks model, where you have a trained decision-maker in faculty with workload. Griffith uses a different model, but you're still going to end up with somebody making the decision around a breach. You really need to resource them and properly give them workload. At my institution, the numbers change, but roughly we provide about 3 hours per case. And we look at caseload over a year. So for example, in business, you're going to have many more breach reports than you might have in the humanities. So averaged out, if you did a contract cheating investigation, it might take you 20 hours, but the average bread and butter of what an AIO will do will be like just the cut and paste inadvertent plagiarism, which might take half an hour or an hour at the most. So we average it out at around 3 hours per case, and also allow workload for those decision makers to be the champions, to go to speak to the large courses, to speak to the tutors during their first training session and so on. So they need to be adequately resourced, real workload, not just another thing you do. It also can't just be given to someone because they don't have enough teaching. Oh, you can be the academic integrity decision maker now this semester, and the person's like, I don't want to do it, I don't care. You've got to get someone with some intrinsic motivation. And then you need to provide a community of practice for them for support. One idea is, I think, at least a number of professional development sessions across the year where AIOs, academic integrity officers, whatever you might call them, come together and calibrate different cases. Gee, I had this and it was a third year student, and what did you do? Also an online discussion forum, so when they've got a tricky case, they can put it out there and all the other decision makers can say, well, what, you're going to let them resubmit? No way. You know, in our discipline, we would say for sure that's going to be suspension. And then people have a conversation, a mentoring process when you have a new decision maker, so somebody who's done it for a while can help them. It's about following your policy consistently and fairly. But so we think about those guys, but what about all the support staff? Librarians are often right at the front and they see students using sources in crazy ways. We need to get them as part of our campaign. Learning advisors, obviously, are critical. Academic developers working with staff on curriculum. I'm going to talk about curriculum in a moment. Exam invigilators. Now, our research found, contrary to popular opinion, exams are not the answer. People say, oh, you know what, we're just going to go back to high-stakes invigilated exams and we'll know the students have done it. In fact, our research found that more cheating was self-reported in exams than in assignments, take-home assignments. We're just not catching it. We have a new paper coming out on this shortly, led by Rowena Harper. So watch out for that in HERD. So the invigilated exam is not the answer, but often we have people, for example, they might be retirees or ex-members of the community, and we need to train them. Hey, do you know about cameras in glasses? Do you know about earpieces? Do you know about eye watches? Do you know about some of the strategies students use with mobile phones and so on? We need to really train them. Where I am, because I care about it so much, we provide professional development for professional staff, and they are really keen at every point. Now, we talked about admissions. People are also doing recognition of prior learning. They need to know how this actually all impacts on academic integrity. Our marketing folk, here's where they can promote academic integrity in the way they promote our university. Counsellors. I'm going to mention this a few times, but in my opinion, you can never have a breach decision without meeting with the student. Breaches do not occur on a piece of paper. They occur in a student's life. Something's happening in their life. And often, my experience is this might be the first time a student has actually fronted up to meet with somebody, and then you find out, gosh, you know, their mum died 2 weeks ago. They're in bad financial standing and they're desperate. They lost their job. They're having some mental health crisis. Like, nobody knew any of this stuff. I had a case of a student who was in a situation of domestic violence and was so alone. And we were able to refer her on to the appropriate counsellors. Now, this won't necessarily change the outcome of the breach, but that's okay. We now want to get all the support in place for them going forward. And the counsellors need to be briefed about how all those things we looked at before, all those controllable and non-controllable factors, impact on academic integrity. We work really closely with our international advisors as well. At the very formal level, where we're going to, where students been involved in a serious case of cheating, maybe contract cheating, very often it is an international student, and it's the language issue. We make sure the international advisor comes to that meeting. They're not part of the decision making, but they're there because we want the person to say, hey, that's the person here. Meet Christine. She's going to come with you after to talk about your COE or your visa, and here's a face to that person. They may have never met them before. So an international advisor is really important to be part of your community of practice. And the last group, I mentioned this before, everything changed for us when we got involved with our facilities management. I talked about that airdrop of all those contract cheating advertisements. We went and talked to facilities management and we said, when you see all this, can you pull it down? Can you clean it up? Can you chuck it away? And can you tell us about it? And they were like, yes, we want to. And they're like, our sort of little spies on campus now, like, Tracey, I just pulled out another poster in the toilets. I'm like, oh, good job. Now, I wouldn't have seen that, but they do. They're part of the equation as well. Otherwise, we just leave them all up there. So everybody has a role to play. It's a different role. Facilities management are going to be pulling down advertisements telling us about contract cheating people on campus as well. Exam invigilators have a different role. Admissions people have a different role, but we all do have one. So that training for everybody is important. I mentioned before that the cheating students were the least satisfied with the teaching and learning environment, and in particular, this is from our big study, in particular these three things, which we've called the personalised teaching and learning environment. So we asked staff, do you provide opportunities for your students to approach you to get assistance? Do you ensure that students understand the requirements of your assessment? And do you make sure they have enough feedback so that they can learn? Now, staff in the survey said, yeah, we do a great job of that. I reckon it was 95 to 100%. We're awesome. But our cheating students were saying no, they were really dissatisfied with that. As you mentioned, how can you be dissatisfied if you never come to class? That's a very different student, maybe. Not much we can do for them. But there are some simple strategies. We probably won't have time to talk about it today, but think about when might you be available to your students. Does anybody in the room teach? Okay, me too. Okay, just one quick question. So you need to brainstorm with your tutors, with your program staff. Well, one thing we do in my teacher core course in the business school, so I know about this stuff too. If you're in a big lecture theatre, you've got your 50 minutes, right? When do our international students want to talk to us? When do they speak to us? After the lecture. They all come down, right? But you've got your colleague at the door with their USB going, and the recording is about to start in the big lecture theatre, so you can't dilly-dally. So if you're like me, you're like, come with me. By the time I get to the end of the door, the end of the lecture theatre, I've lost them. So a very simple strategy I've said to my teaching staff is, you've got 50 minutes in the lecture theatre. No, you don't. You've got 40. Cut some slides, refer them to the LMS, tell your students at the beginning, I will be here for 10 minutes at the end. That's when they want to come to see us, not in your office hours at 8 o'clock on a Monday. That's just one very simple thing that brainstorming with your teaching team, you'll come up with some ideas. We know this. The cheating students are least satisfied with these things. How can we respond to it? So this data comes from our contract cheating and assessment design project. And this is really a summary of the assessment tasks. I'm not sure if you can read them. I'll take you through them. We asked students which assessment types were more or less likely to be outsourced. Now, we're told this is the more reliable way of saying, have you ever done it? But what do you think in your discipline is likely to be outsourced? This one says short turnaround time, which we defined as less than a week. We give students less than a week to do it. And I had a very senior manager tell me a few years ago, I can tell you how to fix this. Give them the assignment Monday, and then tell them it's due Friday. They'll have no time. but you saw the data that Christine showed you. You can get it in 3 hours. That's not an answer. And in fact, look at this. Even our non-cheating students, that's the yellow, 40% of them said that would be likely to be outsourced. So for both cheating and non-cheating students, you're going to push them to outsource it the less time you give. Please don't use that strategy. That is the worst thing we can do. Heavily weighted tasks, which we defined as worth 40% or more, also, that's the next most likely to be outsourced at quite a high number. Again, for even 40% of our non-cheating students said, put that pressure on me and it's going to be tempting. Remember, we talked about anxiety and competition, all these things we know about our students. Now, this is very challenging in many universities which have a truncated study period now and only 2 assessment points. The very best you can do is 30 and 70, and if you fail the 30, you're probably going to fail anyway. So when you have people saying, oh, we don't want to have pressure on students, so we're going to have less, assessment types or tasks, you're actually creating a situation where both are heavily weighted. Students are telling us that gives them anxiety, more likely to be outsourced. And here's the thing that's the saddest finding of all, from my perspective. Staff, for good, well-meaning and pedagogic reasons, use continuous tasks. So this is how often they use them. You can see staff, this is the green line if you use them regularly. This is a good thing to do for learning. We want you to, this week, come in and you've got to do the reading and you've got to do a summary and you've got to do a little presentation. And people say, well, I don't want to do this, so I'm going to give each of these little tasks just 2 or 3%, right? But the problem is everyone's trying to ameliorate this situation by doing continuous tasks. If you're a full-time student, you're in 4 courses, let's say you've got 10 weeks in a study period, maybe more. That's 40 continuous tasks, plus your heavily weighted ones. And the students in the qualitative data have told us, particularly online continuous tasks that no one monitors either, or it's done in class, I'll talk about that in a second, where the staff member says, oh, do that and I'll come back in a minute and check that you've done it. Students make a strategic decision, it might be in a group, I outsource week 1 to you, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5. So your whole group is only learning 1 week of the material. So you're not actually achieving the learning that you think you are. So my advice about those continuous tasks, by all means keep using them, but don't imagine it means the students have achieved the learning outcomes, and reconsider whether you attach any grade to it. Do it in class as well. Now, so people are using these sequence tasks, which is good, they're getting less and less likely. The ones that are the least likely to be outsourced are completed in class, no surprise, except that 20% of our cheating students said they'll still outsource it if it's in class. I'm like, what? How? And I've spoken to staff, I'm like, oh yeah, I see people using their phones, I see them, talking to others, I see them, colluding, I see them going onto their computers and they're checking, finding an answer that way. They get it from the person who did the tute before. So even completed in class does not solve the problem, but it is less likely, as is a personalised and unique task. A viva, and by a viva I mean an oral explication of a written task. So I write the assignment, and now you as my teacher is going to say, hey Tracey, so what did you think, what did you mean by that concept? And tell us more about that, and how did you come up with your conclusion? That's what a viva is. And a reflection on a practicum. We saw a lot, you saw what Christine was showing you too, that little Wordle. There's no assessment type which can't be outsourced, including reflections. But if it's on a practicum, it's less likely because you had to do the practicum, you had to physically turn up. But it still can be outsourced. You can see that there. About 15% of our cheating students still outsource a reflection on a practicum. But these are the ones least likely to be outsourced. And look at this. These are the tasks least likely to be used by staff. Why do you think that is? Why are these the least likely to be used by staff? Exactly. It's time consuming. A personalised and unique task, you've got 500 students, so even in finance, even if you've got a spreadsheet, you create a unique data set for everyone, then you've got to mark it, then you've got time consuming. A viva, 35 students in a tutorial class. Some classes have 50 minutes. How are you going to do a viva? Completed in class, you already have a truncated study period. My course coordinator told me I can only spend 40 minutes on the lecture now, so I'm trying to get more material in the tute. How do I spend time on a completed in class task? It's about time. It's about resources. It's about marking. So again, when you have well-meaning people saying we need to have more students in the class because that'll be, they don't come anyway, so let's make it more. Or, we're going to run these parallel study periods, so you've got staff going from one study period to another with no time in between to address their assessment needs. So this is about timing and resourcing. We know now these tasks are least likely to be outsourced, but they still can be. On our contract cheating and assessment design website, we provide a range of things like this, just double-sided A4 sheets, to give you some clues about how you might address this. Not because we have the answers, we're really just brainstorming with you. Talking about low-stakes practice and feedback that happens in class, peer collaboration if it's appropriate, maybe doing a viva or maybe doing even a random viva. I've seen some staff say, well, I can't do a viva in every class, but what we say in the course outline is at any time, you put your assignment in, you may be asked on a random basis to provide a viva for the class, and that's going to be a conversation. Heavily weighted tasks, again, if you're going to have those 2 assessment points, you need to provide lots of opportunities beforehand to practice. Obviously, people are using sequenced tasks. It's good, but it requires time and resources. So what we found in our project is authentic assessment, which is professionally focused, personal and engaged, future focused, and you can read our papers on this, is a good thing to do for learning. Authentic assessment's great, but don't imagine it's going to solve the problem of contract cheating. What it will do is help you identify it. Because when you have that personalised and unique data set, or it's all about the student, you'll start to see all they've done is do a generic assignment, and that's a marker of contract cheating. So, 5 minutes. I'm watching the time. We're good. 5 minutes to talk about those 4 assessment items, which we know are less likely to be outsourced. Think about the curriculum and assessment strategies at your uni. Do you use these? If you don't, why not? And do you have some other good ideas to share with the group? 5 minutes. Okay, so I have reiterated this many times around training and guidance for staff and students, but also the International Scholarship recommends that institutions have some sort of central unit or a committee or someone who has a remit for this. Now, very often it sits under the DVCA or the provost, but that person has so many different functions. The real question is, who is responsible for academic integrity, really responsible at your institution? The benefit of having that, HEA is the Higher Education Academy, wrote that recommendation in 2011. The buck has to stop somewhere. Someone has to be responsible. When you have a committee or a person or an office responsible, you get a consistent approach and training across the institution. That was going back to your point about pockets of excellent practice, but not reaching others. If you have someone with a remit for that, you're going to make sure that good practice gets shared. They're a central point of expertise for decision making, so the academic integrity breach decision makers have someone to call to get that expertise. And it gets consistent outcomes for students. And we care about that first and foremost because that's natural justice for students. They deserve it. But we care about it secondly is that we want to make sure if a student does appeal and we have substantiated that situation and put all those resources into it, we don't want to at that point have them appeal and say that was completely inconsistent. So we care about them first, and then we care about the natural justice for other students too, because we want students to know that if somebody in their classroom is outsourcing their work or cheating in a serious way, we take it seriously. That will build confidence. If someone has a remit for this, for academic integrity, they're going to then provide a proactive rather than just a reactive stance. They're going to think about how we promote it, how we market it. They're going to look at not just the policy, but about how we build that culture. Who's going to do that if you don't have a central point? And that person or office or committee is also going to have oversight of that breach database so that it really is used for quality assurance and improvement as per the TEXA requirements. This is an example from Anne Rogerson at the University of Wollongong. This comes from the Good Practice Note published on TEXA's website. This is just an example. Anne takes her staff through. Anne's specialty is around paraphrasing and editing tools and contract cheating, and she takes staff through, this is just a quick snap from one of her presentations. She takes staff through all the signals for contract cheating. I'm going to take you through a resource from ours in a moment, but this is one example and it's available with the website there. Another great example about providing training and guidance, the University of Western Australia back in, I think it was 2011, won an ALTC award for this, the Academic Conduct Essentials, which is a mandatory, basically an academic integrity training module for students. And I hear many institutions say, I really like the idea of making it mandatory, but it's all too complicated. These guys did it, 9 years ago nearly. They could do it, we can do it too. I've mentioned the EpiGM Academic Integrity Training Program. It's an online training program through Oxford University Press. Not the only way you could do it. What is unusual about this training program is it's for staff as well. I don't know of any other commercial product which takes you through what you need for staff. I was just chatting to Christine, they've got it at UQ, we've got it at UniSA. It does need to be customised to your policy environment, that just makes sense. Without doing that, there's no template that's going to work for you. But what you don't have to do is recreate the wheel and start again. If you're interested in this, there's a link here. You can ask for a trial version to have a look at it and see how it might or might not be useful. It might just provide impetus for your thinking. I've mentioned this, I've mentioned our colleagues at UDEM in Mexico. There have to be consequences for breaches. No point talking all about this unless you follow through. There's got to be a clear and consistent framework, and it has to be communicated to both staff and students. We use the Oxford Brookes model. I like it. You can use another conceptual model, but for us, decision making has to take into account a range of factors. The first one is the student's education and understanding. For example, a student who's come in from another country, working in another language with a very different educational background, maybe coming in the second year and missing orientation and not doing the module, is going to have a very different understanding than a domestic student who has gone through high school, university, and is now doing a postgraduate degree, right? I mean, it just makes sense. That doesn't mean we're taking a more lenient approach to the first student. It means we're taking into consideration their context. It's about equity. We also need to look at the extent of the breach. I was at a conference not so long ago where somebody from Princeton was saying, we take a zero tolerance approach to breaches. And the example they gave was of an international exchange student who had copied and pasted a couple of lines, not a paragraph even, and they were automatically expelled. They were very proud of this stance they take. And they said, and because of that, we hardly ever have any breaches. I'm like, I bet you don't. Nobody's going to be reporting that, are they? And they're like, oh yeah. So you make it so punitive, you take a one-size-fits-all approach, your staff won't trust the process that you won't have, you'll suddenly magically have no breach reports, you'll be having the breaches still. The level of the student, I've mentioned that with their first, second, third year postgraduate research, and obviously whether the incident's been happening over a period of time, and that's why you need that central breach database so you can look at that. I've had some people say to me, oh Tracey, you've changed. When you used to talk about academic integrity, you'd always be like, take an educative approach. And now you're saying when students get engaged in contract cheating, they should get suspended. I'm like, that is an educative approach. For those students who are not real students, those ghost students, the best thing we can do for all of our students is identify them and ask them to go so they don't waste resources, time and reputation. But also for the students who are not necessarily ghost students but having outsourced their work to a third party, we need them to take a time out. What are you here for? What's your motivation? Where are your skills gaps? Can you go and do some more language training? Can you go and get some more academic literacy support? Don't keep wasting your money on something you're clearly not really going to get any benefit from. So just like we ask our children to take a time out if they're engaging in something which is really quite dangerous, because we don't want them to do it again, we ask our students to take a time out. That's what a suspension is. And then we support them to come back. We want them to come back. We want them to come and achieve the learning outcomes. So for me, it's not punishment, it's educative. Here's another lovely example from Curtin. You don't necessarily need to read it all. But what I like is they have a very simple rubric. I love their colour scheme. They start here. This is an educational advice going right down to rescission or withholding of the degree. And you've got like a marking rubric. If you've got dots here, this is what happens. If you've got it down here, this is what happens. And that is freely available to students and staff. So we can see what we might expect to happen in a breach outcome. Our data from the Contract Cheating and Assessment Design project showed that staff often don't report. They often don't report, and the reasons they provided were these. This perception that it's impossible to prove. Certainly that was my view 5 years ago. I've changed. I'll share with you the rubric in a moment. The critical thing here is we're not a court of law. We're an educational institution. We're not trying to prove beyond reasonable doubt. We're trying to substantiate using clear and convincing evidence on the balance of probabilities. So I'll share with you about that in a moment. Too time consuming. Yes, it is. It's very time consuming to substantiate contract cheating, which is why you need trained decision makers. It would be unreasonable to ask your marking staff, especially when so many of them are sessional, to devote hours to trying to substantiate a case. A little bit like that curtain flowchart before, you get to this point and you stop. Stop marking, hand it on to somebody. You're still going to get paid for marking and you're not going to be in trouble, but let somebody else deal with it now. And then that's that stuff around senior management leadership. Staff often don't feel encouraged to report. They might put all that work in and then they're told, oh look, that's just not necessary, just mark according to the rubric. Give them 0. Technology can help. I've mentioned it and it has to be resourced appropriately. Turnitin has a new piece of software called Authorship Investigate, which I think has a lot of potential. And I certainly contributed to the development of that software, as did many colleagues. Have I recommended to my own institution to implement it? No, I have not. Why might that be when I think it's got a lot of potential and it's good? My issue is we already use software that is under-resourced, staff are not adequately trained. Across the sector, it's not used in an appropriate way in many cases. Let's use the technology we have to its full capacity before we go buying another technological solution that none of us know how to use. If you wanted to implement this software, and I do think it's good, really think hard then about how you would do that, how you're going to resource and train your staff appropriately. Don't just think the tech is going to sort out the problem. So on our contract cheating and assessment website, we have, this actually is in a one-page document like this. And on one side are the principles and on the other side are the textual signals, and we created a rubric. I just didn't put it up here like that because you wouldn't be able to read it. And I want to take you through it. So you never start looking at the text. You start with the principles. And the first one is educate staff. If you have not devoted resources to educating your staff, you will not be able to identify contract cheating. That's the first thing. You're looking for a range of signals of cheating, not hard proof about one thing. People say, I didn't have the receipt, so what could I do? How could I prove they paid for it? And that's why it goes back to our original definition. Whether they paid for it or not is not the issue. The issue is whether they outsourced it to someone else. So forget about your receipt, you don't need it. That would be one of the signals you'd use though if you had that evidence, that'd be handy. If your policy and your procedure is not in place, you can't ask people to be doing this. So we start with policy. I've mentioned this, it's not proof but balance of probabilities, clear and convincing evidence. So my analogy, it's like a puzzle. If anybody does puzzles, anybody here? Oh, okay, so do you do big ones, like thousands? Yeah. Okay, I don't know what your house is like, but in my house, if we're doing thousands, I'm terrible at them, the dining table's covered for, forever, right? And you really love it, and you come back to it a week later and you look at it, and 3 months later, this 5,000 piece, right? You're at the end, and I don't know what happened. The dog ate this corner, yeah. The children bumped it, the vacuum cleaner took it, you're missing bits and pieces. Nonetheless, you persevere because when you look at your puzzle, you can see it really is a rainbow and a unicorn. You're missing this little bit of grass down here and you're missing that cloud, but the picture is still overwhelmingly a rainbow and a unicorn. You're like, a bit cranky, I couldn't get all those pieces, but I can see the picture. That's what substantiating contract cheating is. You don't have every single piece of that puzzle, but you can see the big picture. It's clear and convincing evidence. You need to look at all aspects of the document, but not just that. You need to interview the student. I've mentioned that a few times. Academic integrity is about the student's learning, so we always meet with the student. We collect evidence from a range of sources, not just the assessment. You might look at their exam. You might look at their email communication. You might look at assessments in another course, which is what Authorship Investigate will do for you, which is great. You'll look at the linguistic patterns. You're going to look at the properties of the document, the author name, where it was located, how long it was taken to edit. Yeah? And as an academic, as a teacher with many years' experience, you're going to trust yourself. If it looks odd, probably is odd for a reason, and then you're going to consult. Ensure natural justice. Always make sure that the student is supported through this process, because sometimes you may think it's odd, just stands out, and you meet with the student and you're like, wow, those guys, they really worked so hard. In fact, I think it is their work. So you don't want to assume they're guilty. You also don't want them to be freaked out by the process. You want them to come away trusting you more, that you care about this, that your institution really cares about academic integrity. And there's that thing about the puzzle and the picture. You want to evaluate the evidence to get an overall picture. So once you've got all these principles in your mind, you're not trying to just prove it with a receipt. Now you go to the actual assessment item. Now, most of us are very familiar with using text matching software, and we know if it's 80 or 90%, you know, some high match, it probably is dodgy and we need to look at it. Remember, there's no magic number, but we're going to look at that if it's a high number. But a low number is also a really big sign of contract cheating. Remember I said if you put your own work through, you'll see it's 10 or 20%, just if you've got your references in order. So if you had a 0, or less than 5 even, it's not by itself a thing. Remember, it's one signal. You'd be like, oh, that's a bit odd. Now, the rubric we've developed for you, we've got no concern, some concern, high concern. So like any rubric, you start ticking it. If you've got lots of high concerns down the side, you're like, oh, I'm going to refer that on to a decision maker. The document properties I've mentioned, it might be that it's not appropriate for your discipline area. We see very generic essays being written by contract cheating services. The quality is different to your expectations. Our staff told us that the 3 ways they can identify contract cheating. The first one was knowing their student. And that's handy if you've got 44 students. A bit harder for me if I've got 160 or 500 in a first year course. The second one was knowing the student's linguistic abilities. And the third one was text matching software. Because remember, these contract cheating services are still cutting and pasting from sources. They've got very little time. So your old-fashioned text matching software, if you know how to use it, could also be useful. Even telling your tutors, hey, have a look, here's the match. There's a 40% match to 123helpme.com. So look at your references. That's going to give you a clue. We've mentioned language mismatch. That's a clear indicator between what you know of the student and what they're doing, their other assignments. Inappropriate or false references. False references are a classic sign of a contract cheating service. They just stick them randomly in. So you can actually see they might be a real reference, but it's nothing to do with the material that's been cited in the assignment. Doesn't meet the assessment criteria. So, for example, you might be doing a very authentic task. One of the examples I have, I teach communication, so we do all this theory about communication. Then I ask the student to apply it to their professional, their personal environment. But what I get on a contract cheating assignment, how sad am I when I get that? Can you imagine? I've just told them this is my thing, and they still do it. Foreign language references. When we meet with the student, we're like, oh, can you speak Japanese? They're like, no. The assignment just seems strange. When you're marking a whole cohort of students, you'll think, this just stands out weirdly. Okay, so you've got a rubric you can use. In a moment, I'm going to get you to tell us what you do as well. So if you could talk in your groups, what strategies do you use or could you use? Maybe you've got things to add to that. Something I've been learning recently is IP addresses, which I don't have on that rubric. You've got learning analytics on your website, right? And often we don't use them. They're all there. Another piece of tech we don't use because we don't know how to. But I've learned about IP addresses, and I can see when a student is using the same username and password in Kenya at 5 minutes to midnight, and a couple of minutes later, they're logging in with the same details in Adelaide. So someone is, at the very least, that's a security breach, but it's one of those signals. I would say high concern there. That gives me a high concern. And that's when I meet with the student. 5 minutes to have a chat about what you do. So remember I said that often staff don't report because they feel it's too time consuming, they can't prove it, they're not supported. Those that did report said actually they were disappointed because the outcomes were so lenient. So, for example, for an outsourced assignment, despite the recommendations in the good practice note around 0 for the assignment, failure in the course and suspension, only 3% were being suspended, 2% excluded. By and large, and this doesn't add up to 100 because you can have multiples of these, by and large students are getting a warning and a 0 for the assignment. Now, in my opinion, that's no penalty at all. They were always going to get 0 because they didn't do it. So they've got nothing to lose if they think, well, I can't get the work done, I might as well get someone else, because the chances of getting caught are so slim, because it's time consuming, because we don't have enough resources. So if you are, I think it's 1% or something of students are ever called in for any sort of academic integrity breach. Now remember those numbers we talked about before, 80% of students say they plagiarise, 6 to 8% say they engage in contract cheating, only 1% are even getting caught. So if they get caught and they get a 0, it's been substantiated, they'll be like, woohoo, nothing to lose. I'll just do that course again because I'm doing it in all my others. So really think about that. Also, that's going to really make staff despondent. All that work they did, all that time, that commitment, and now it's like, I could have given them 0 myself. But look at this one. You'd have to agree the most egregious breach is getting someone else to be you in an exam. And even in that case, it tends to be a 0 for the exam and a warning. Now, in my view, the student has to, at a minimum, be suspended or excluded. If you go to the trouble of getting someone else to do your work, and our data showed you're more likely to pay for someone an impersonation, fair enough, people aren't that altruistic, and you're so unlikely to have a serious outcome. Yeah, it's very problematic. The biggest issue for me, though, is it makes staff lose their trust in the system. One of the ways that we want to encourage this shared understanding, but also how we implement our policy, is building a culture on your campus. This is not the only way to do it. These are big posters that we've developed on my campus. This is an actual student. She talks all about the values of academic integrity. This one talks about the risks if you engage in breaches, but we never use that word. We never use the word misconduct, cheating, ever. It's all about academic integrity. This one here says, if you can't read it, academic integrity is critical to learning, to the value of your degree, and to preparation for your career. It's vital for UniSA's reputation and your future contribution to society. Stay focused on what's important. We're allowed 35 words. That's how we have to get the message across. And we've used, we tried to find a very engaging way so that we weren't telling students don't be cheaters. We used acrobatics, juggling, that's juggling, parkour, hula hooping. And at all of our events, we have someone going around juggling and talking about academic integrity, plus we have our academic integrity dog and our ambassadors that walk around. We try to find a way to engage with students without telling them that we think they're cheaters, about why it's important. This is just one way. And we have these are great big high, 3 metre high decals stuck on the wall all around the campus. Another way to make academic integrity visible, another example from Griffith, they are not scared to share their breach data. Look at this, 2016-17, it goes back. You can look at their breach data, not identifying anybody, but you can look at patterns. We had 80% of our cases in 2005 were plagiarism. Now we've got 10% that are contract cheating or whatever. And it's about demonstrating to members of the community that we care about this. We're not trying to hide it. We're not worried about putting it under the mat. We're going to talk about it. I think that's an important thing to do. This graph shows the concern, the level of concern about contract cheating from our data. So the cheating group is here. They're slightly concerned. Of course, they're slightly concerned. They're engaging in it. Staff are moderately to extremely concerned. But the group that's really interesting are our non-cheating students. They follow the same trajectory as the cheating students. They're not concerned. They're not concerned at all. I think they think, oh, that's just you being an idiot. You don't learn, I don't care, I'm going to do my learning well. But we need to persuade all of our students, remember that 44% perhaps cheat curious group, that it will undermine the value of their degree if they're competing for the same job with somebody who cheated their way through, the reputation of their institution. But we're not talking to students about it. Only 1 in 5 students in our survey said that anyone had talked to them about contract cheating on their campus. So we talk a lot about academic integrity, the policy, but we don't talk about this particular threat. And remember, students are being bombarded every day by these commercial sites, but we're not giving them a counter message. And the non-cheating students are thinking, oh, well, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to worry about it. We need them to get on board. I've talked about partnering with students, and you can get them also involved in the breach decision-making process. Having more students, especially at that formal level where you're likely to suspend a student, have some student voice there. Here's a great example of partnering with students from Deakin University. The students themselves developed this campaign and had a whole contract cheating awareness week. It's not the way I would do it. Like you can see, I had this whole, very positive and open approach. But, the students themselves chose to take this approach, and then they're more likely to own it. They had a little spinny wheel where people came up, they spun the wheel. What happens if you get caught contract cheating? It's like suspension, 0 mark. It was like really bad stuff. And the colouring here all comes from Deakin University's branding. So that's a great way to get students involved. Macquarie University, remember they did that research on honour codes and found students didn't want to do that, but they wanted to have a student-led organisation. And they've followed the example of the Academic Integrity Matters student-led organisation from UCSD, University of California, San Diego, led by Tricia Bertram-Gallant, who's an expert on this. So they use all the materials from there. Tricia came over and mentored them to run the organisation, and you can see they've had lots of engagement. Some other examples. Our colleague Kiara Rundle is a PhD student at UWA. She developed a lovely little animation, cost her $80 to do, about ghostwriting, which is really fantastic. Have a look at it later at your leisure. Amanda White from UTS has developed an academic integrity board game. Have you seen it? Did you know about it? It is so lovely. It's all open access. You go online, you print it out, you just cut out the pieces. Very simple. Your little spinny wheel. She even does YouTubes to show you how to create the materials. She'll come to your institution and train you how to run the game as well. It's great for staff and students. I really recommend it. It's great. Again, a little bit like the EpiGM program, you would have to adapt it to your policy context because it's about UTS. Very simple to do. They're all in Word. Our colleague at ICMS in Sydney has an academic integrity week. They get the students involved through the student association. Lots of examples. Many of you might have heard of the International Day of Action Against Contract Cheating. Every year, the International Centre for Academic Integrity runs this. These are all the countries that participate. They get students to do a whiteboard declaration about why they wouldn't contract cheat with the hashtags defeat the cheat and excel with integrity. And it really, I think last year they reached 1 million retweets. So it's again about trying to build a culture of understanding around this topic. We're not going to have time, I'm so sorry. I want you to have a think about, as you go back to your institutions, about how you partner with your students. Remember that diagram. There's no point having this policy and imposing it on our students. If they own it, they're more likely to love it and follow through. Margot McNeill, who's part of our project team, her specialty is transformational change for institutions. And I've heard her speak about this, and she says when we're trying to change things, often we're overwhelmed by the messiness and the complexity. It's like this, you can't make sense of it. There's so many things we need to do. So she says, look, put it all together and do one thing at a time and group things so you can actually manage it. We know that curriculum is a critical area. We've talked today about some of the research on curriculum and assessment. Teachers and teaching, resource it. Technology can really help us, both commercial programs like Turnitin or Authorship Investigate, Urkund, but also our own learning analytics is available, working with our tech teams to block contract cheating sites. So technology can play a critical role and we need to bring them into the conversation. And we've talked about leadership and the role of senior managers and how, we need leadership from the top. It's not enough for provosts or deputy vice chancellors to tell us, fix your assessment, it'll all be okay. We need them to champion this issue and resource it appropriately. And then Margot's taken those 4 groups and she's given you some examples, and I'm sure you can think of others, about how academic integrity fits into those 4 areas. About your institutional strategy, we talked about reviewing policies and monitoring and reporting, taking an everybody's business approach to academic integrity and really embedding it in our roles and in our training and our guidance and our performance appraisals. I've mentioned that before. We want to change culture, we make it part of what we report on. We've talked about curriculum. I hope I've given you some ideas to go back to your program teams and think it through. There are some tasks which are less likely to be outsourced. That's not the answer, but nonetheless, we should still be using those. And I've mentioned technology. So, in the last couple of minutes, this is something I think we need to end our workshop on, having a think about who has a remit for academic integrity at your institution. How are you going to take it forward? What needs to happen for sustainable change where you are? So working in your groups, have a chat about that, because you need to come away from this workshop, go back to your institution and say, this is what we can do. We've got these 4 areas, but who is leading it? 5 minutes to talk about that. We are out of time. I hope you've found it useful and that you will take the learning back to your institution. Please complete the workshop evaluation on the flip side of the pre-workshop. Don't cheat. Don't look at what you wrote before. I trust you to have integrity. Once you've filled that in, Christine will collect them, and we've also got a little goodie for you to take away, which is a summary of all the material we covered today. You can also have this PowerPoint presentation. I want to acknowledge the various projects and individuals who've worked so hard, including our own institutions. Lots of references here. You don't need to find them by yourself. Also links to other academic integrity organisations all around the world. We're not alone. There's other institutions which partner with us. And also the links to the academic integrity research projects that I've mentioned. And all of those have websites with lots and lots of teaching and learning resources and videos and activities and classroom tasks and so on. So you can look at the research, but you can also look at the very simple sort of resources we provided. Thank you so much.